The floorboards in the attic didn't just creak. They groaned like a dying animal before splitting wide beneath Mayev's weight. As her leg plunged into the dark, jagged void of the joists, the scent of 50 years of trapped rot and damp earth surged upward, thick enough to taste. She clawed at a support beam, her fingers catching on a rusted tin box hidden deep within the wall's insulation. It was unnaturally cold, vibrating with a dull metallic thud when she pulled it free, as if something heavy and solid was desperate to get out. Downstairs, the kitchen light flickered and died, just as Mayev jammed a serrated knife under the tin's lid. The screech of metal on metal echoed through the hollow house, a sound indistinguishable from a human scream. As the lid flew off, a cascade of yellowed envelopes and blurred photos spilled across the linoleum, revealing a name that had been forbidden in the Jenkins home for 2 decades. Mayev's breath hitched as she realized the stains on the paper weren't just ink, and the silence of the house she thought she knew was about to become deafening. The phone on Mayev's desk buzzed again, another missed call from the shelter. She ignored it, fingers hovering over the keyboard, as the woman across from her slammed a crumpled eviction notice onto the desk. "You people got my money or not?" Her voice cracked, but her knuckles stayed white around the paper, veins bulging like cracked pavement. Mayev exhaled through her nose, the scent of stale coffee and antiseptic burning her throat. The woman's breath reeked of menthol and something sour, like spoiled milk left in the sun. Behind her, a toddler with snot-crusted cheeks banged a plastic cup against the armrest, the rhythm uneven, relentless. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound vibrated in Mayev's molars. "Ma'am, I need you to fill out, I ain't filling shit till I see my check." The woman's chair screeched as she shoved it back, the metal legs scraping against linoleum. A pen rolled off the desk, clattering to the floor. Neither of them moved to pick it up. Mayev's screen flickered, a new email from HR about mandatory sensitivity training. She minimized it before the woman could see. The clock above the door ticked too loud, each second a needle pricking her temples. Outside, a car alarm wailed, then cut off abruptly. Silence settled for half a breath before the toddler let out a shriek, high and jagged, like a fork dragged across a plate. The woman didn't flinch. "You deaf or something?" Mayev's thumb pressed into the paper cut on her palm, the sting sharp enough to clear the fog. She reached for a fresh form, the edges still warm from the printer. "Let's start with your last pay stub." Her voice didn't waver. Neither did the woman's glare. The day didn't improve. It dissolved into a blur of gray faces and sharp demands. Mayev pressed her fingers into her temples, trying to block out the rhythmic wail of a child in the waiting area. The air in the Tulsa Social Services office felt thick, a soup of cheap chlorine and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. A man with a neck tattoo and eyes like burnt coals lunged toward her desk, his movements jagged. He didn't speak. He snarled, throwing a mangled stack of welfare forms at her. One of the pages caught the air, spinning like a blade, and sliced a thin line across Mayev's cheek. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. She simply watched as a single bead of crimson escaped the shallow cut, falling slowly to stain the beige folder on her desk. Her back was a column of frozen knots, a map of every 12-hour shift she'd endured in this graveyard of hope. When the doors finally locked behind her, the heat of the Oklahoma evening hit her like a physical blow. It was a heavy, stagnant warmth that tasted of dust and exhaust. Mayev drove toward the outskirts, toward the house that sat like a rotting tooth in the jaw of a dying neighborhood. The heavy oak door groaned as she pushed it open, releasing a draft of trapped, overheated air. Inside, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, dying hum of the refrigerator. She walked into the living room, her footsteps echoing off the floorboards with a hollow, accusatory sound. Dust motes swirled in the dying orange light of the sunset, dancing over furniture that hadn't been moved since her mother's funeral. Mayev ran a hand over the back of an armchair, the fabric rough and gray with neglect. The loneliness here wasn't a lack of people. It was a presence. A heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders, stealing her breath. She moved to the kitchen, the linoleum peeling at the corners like dead skin. A stack of unpaid bills and tax notices sat on the table, a testament to her inability to keep the ghosts at bay. Her fingers shook as she reached for a pen. The house was a parasite, draining her bank account and her sanity, tethering her to a past she couldn't outrun. With a sharp, decisive movement, she signed the contract with the realtor. She pressed the seal into the paper with enough force to bruise the wood beneath, a silent declaration of war against the memories. The ghosts were losing their sanctuary today. The air grew thinner as she climbed the narrow, rickety stairs to the attic. Heat had pooled under the roof, a dry, suffocating pressure that made her lungs ache. Dust swirled into her nose, triggering a fit of coughing that left her leaning against a beam, gasping. The low rafters seemed to sag, the walls closing in as she pushed aside stacks of disintegrating cardboard boxes. Sweat stung her eyes, blurring her vision as she dragged a heavy trunk out from the shadows. It was her mother's. Mayev fumbled with the top button of her blouse, desperate for air in the airless dark. She shifted toward a pile of mildewed blankets when a sharp, dry crack goed through the space. The floor gave way. Her right leg plunged through a rotted board, sinking into the dark void of the joists up to her knee. She let out a strangled cry, her arms flailing until her fingers caught the rough, splintered edge of a support beam. The scent of ancient rot and damp earth rose from the hole, a foul breath from the house's lungs. Pulling her leg free, Mayev stared at the jagged opening. The foundation of her family was as hollow as the wood beneath her feet. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a panicked bird seeking exit. In the furthest corner, something glinted. She crawled toward it, tossing aside a heavy, damp quilt that released a cloud of gray lint. There, tucked away as if it were a shameful secret, sat a large tin box, an old biscuit tin with a faded floral pattern. The metal was unnaturally cold against her palms. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. When she shook it, something inside gave a dull, metallic thud. A shiver raced down her spine, the hair on her arms standing up in the stifling heat. She clawed at the twine wrapped around the box, but the knots were tight, biting into her skin. The rusted latch held firm. Panic, sharp and irrational, flared in her chest. She scrambled down the stairs, nearly falling in her haste to reach the kitchen. She tore through the utility drawer until her hand closed around a heavy, serrated knife. Standing at the table, she clutched the tin to her chest. Part of her wanted to hurl it through the window, to let the Tulsa wind scatter whatever was inside before it could speak. She didn't. She drove the blade under the lid. The screech of metal on metal was a scream in the quiet house. The lid flew off, clattering onto the floor, and a cascade of yellowed envelopes and blurred Polaroid photos spilled across the table. Mayev's breath came in ragged gulps. She picked up a photo, her mother, years younger, but the expression was wrong. It wasn't the soft, tired woman Mayev remembered. It was someone sharp, someone watchful. Her hands trembled as she reached for the first envelope. The name written on it was one that had been forbidden in this house for 20 years. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but legible. As Mayev read, the world outside the kitchen window seemed to gray out. The letters weren't notes of affection, they were a ledger of cruelty. Her mother had documented everything, The muffled cries behind locked doors, the systematic breaking of the younger children, the accidents that Mayev now realized were calculated strikes. Each sentence felt like a blow to the solar plexus. She saw dates that matched her own childhood scars, her own falls and clumsy moments. It hadn't been neglect. It had been a strategy. The paper crumpled in her fist as she reached the final page, an account of a crime so cold it defied the very concept of family. She looked around the kitchen. The floral wallpaper, the sturdy table, the expensive car her father had driven. It was all a stage set. The education Cassidy had received, the very clothes on Mayev's back, had been bought with the silence of the broken. The facade of Jenkins' respectability was a thin skin over a pit of filth. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She saw the smiling faces in the photos and realized they all knew. Every aunt, every cousin, every respectable member of the clan had seen the price of their comfort and looked away. The bile rose too fast to stop. Mayev lunged for the sink, retching until her throat burned. The walls of the kitchen began to tilt and slide, the floor becoming a liquid thing beneath her feet. She slid down the cabinets, her knees hitting the linoleum as she rocked back and forth. The image of her mother, the saintly, suffering Eleanor, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The woman who had tucked her in had been a monster, who watched the clock while people bled. The silence of the house was now a scream. Mayev reached for her phone, her fingers numb as she dialed Cassidy's number. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was a rasp, a jagged edge of sound. "Get here," she demanded, her words cutting through whatever excuse Cassidy was trying to make. "Tulsa. Now. The house is being sold, and you're going to help me burn the rest of it down." She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white, watching her own frantic, wild-eyed reflection in the dark window. The arrival of her sister was marked by the violent slam of the front door. Cassidy swept into the hall, a cloud of expensive perfume and city arrogance. She tossed her keys onto the side table without looking at Mayev, her heels clicking a sharp, impatient rhythm on the hardwood. "I have 3 days, Mayev," Cassidy snapped, adjusting her coat. "I want the realtor's check and a flight back to Dallas. I'm not doing an inventory of Mom's cracked teacups." She checked her watch, her eyes roaming the room with a focused, clinical disgust. Mayev didn't answer with words. She grabbed the handful of letters and hurled them at Cassidy's feet. The papers fluttered through the air like dying birds, but Cassidy stepped back as if they were venomous. She curled her lip, a sneer of practiced indifference. "You've finally lost it," Cassidy said, her voice dripping with venom. "Locked yourself in this tomb until your brain rotted? You want to play act some family drama? Do it on your own time." She turned toward the window, her fingers drumming a restless beat on the wood, ignoring Mayev's frantic gestures toward the mother's handwriting. Then the house spoke back. A muffled, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards, followed by a wet, tearing sound from the ceiling of the second-floor hallway. A pipe, ancient and choked with rust, finally surrendered to the pressure. A torrent of gray, freezing water erupted, turning the staircase into a jagged waterfall. The spray hit Mayev's face, soaking through her shirt in seconds. Cassidy shrieked as the deluge ruined her shoes, the two of them suddenly trapped in a roar of falling water and the stench of wet plaster and old metal. They scrambled toward the utility closet, shoulders colliding in the narrow space. Cassidy shoved Mayev, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "I hate this place," Cassidy screamed over the roar of the leak. "I hate that you stayed here like a dog guarding a grave. You love being the martyr, don't you? You love the smell of the rot." Mayev grabbed Cassidy's shoulders, her own clothes heavy and dripping. You think I wanted this? You ran. You left me to drown in it. Because you chose it. Cassidy shoved her back, her heels skidding in the growing pool of filth. You turned your life into a dumpster fire just so you could feel superior. A thunderous crack cut through the argument. A massive section of the living room ceiling, bloated with water, tore free from the joists. It slammed onto the floor inches from Cassidy, a rain of gray insulation and sodden drywall filling the air with a choking, chemical dust. The heavy chandelier overhead groaned, swinging on its wires and sending a spray of sparks across the wet floor. Cassidy stood frozen, her hands over her mouth, as the remnants of their childhood home disintegrated around them. In the pocket of Mayev's wet jeans, her phone began a persistent, high-pitched whine. She pulled it out with shaking hands. A notification from the department. Urgent. The text blurred, but the words formal complaint and suspension stood out in stark, digital clarity. The man from the office, the one whose blood had stained her desk, had followed through. Mayev felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the water. Her career, the one thing she'd built to distance herself from the Jenkins name, was collapsing as surely as the roof. She didn't wait. She drove to the office in her damp clothes, the Tulsa sun outside feeling like a mockery. Her supervisor's office smelled of rich coffee and old leather, a world of order that Mayev no longer inhabited. He didn't ask her to sit. He simply pushed a file across the desk, a red marker circling her errors, her missed signatures, her unstable interactions. Administrative leave, he said, his voice a flat, mechanical drone. Effective immediately. Mayev walked out into the blinding light, feeling the weight of her dignity stripping away like old paint. When she returned to the house, the smell of damp was a physical weight. She found Cassidy in the living room, kneeling by the fireplace. A small, orange flame was licking at a pile of the letters. "What are you doing?" Mayev's voice was a ghost of a sound. Cassidy didn't look up. She tossed another page into the fire. "Cleaning up," she whispered. Ending it, Mayev lunged, burning her fingers as she snatched a smoldering page from the grate. Cassidy scrambled up, her eyes wide with a frantic, feral light. "You knew," Mayev screamed, holding the charred paper like a weapon. "You knew what she was. You knew about the basement, about the marks. I had to leave." Cassidy's voice broke into a jagged sob. "I couldn't breathe here. I left you because if I stayed, I would have ended up like her or like the ones she broke. I used you, Mayev. I used you as a shield so I could go be someone clean." She collapsed back against the wall, the admission leaving her hollow. The rain began then. Not a drizzle, but a violent, Midwestern deluge that turned the world outside the windows into a gray smear. Thunder shook the house, the vibrations rattling Mayev's very teeth. She retreated to the attic as the water began to find new ways in, dripping through the holes in the roof. She sat on the floor, the tin box clutched to her chest. The air so thick with humidity, it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. A pair of headlights cut through the storm, illuminating the yard. Cassidy had tried to leave, but the road was a river of mud and runoff. She came back inside, defeated by the weather, her movements slow and heavy. She found Mayev in the ruins of the living room. The two of them sat in the dark, the only light coming from the occasional blue-white flash of lightning. "Listen to this," Mayev said, her voice flat. She opened the tin. She began to read the final letter, the one she'd been too afraid to finish. It was a meticulous account of their Aunt Ellen's death. Not a fall. A trap. A calculated removal of a woman who stood between their mother and a trust fund. Cassidy's face went bloodless. She tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. Mayev kept reading, her voice rising to compete with the wind howling in the chimney. She read the descriptions of the bruises, the way their mother had waited at the top of the stairs, watching, making sure the job was done. Cassidy let out a low, animal moan. She lunged for the paper, her fingers clawing at Mayev's hands. They went down together, sliding across the wet floorboards, a tangle of limbs and resentment. Cassidy bit Mayev's hand. Mayev shoved her elbow into Cassidy's ribs. They fought like children, like animals, among the shards of their mother's fine china and the filth of the fallen ceiling. Finally, Mayev threw her sister off. She stood over her, chest heaving. She was a murderer, Cassidy. She wasn't just difficult or strict. She was a predator, and we lived in her den. The fight leaked out of Cassidy. She curled into a ball on the floor, her forehead resting on the damp wood. "I saw it," she whispered. "The night Ellen died. I saw her with the saw at the stairs. I told myself it was a dream. I've lived 20 years telling myself I was crazy so I didn't have to be the daughter of a monster." Mayev knelt beside her. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She reached out and touched Cassidy's hair, the first time they'd been close in a decade. They stayed like that as the storm raged, two survivors huddled in the wreckage of a lie. By dawn, the rain had tapered to a gray mist. The house was quiet, the water having settled into stagnant pools. Mayev moved with a strange, calm purpose. She gathered every scrap of paper, every photo, every lingering ember of their mother's life, and packed them into the tin. Cassidy helped, her movements silent and synchronized with Mayev's. The calls were made. A cleaning crew to handle the immediate rot, an appraiser to value the land. Mayev didn't care about the price. She wanted the deed out of her name. She met with an attorney, laying out the letters, the evidence of a 20-year-old murder. Then, the police station. The detective was young, his face unreadable as Mayev told the story of the stairs, of the saw, of the woman who had been a pillar of the community. When she signed her statement, she felt a physical weight lift from her chest. Back at the house, the sisters dragged the furniture out onto the dying grass of the backyard. The velvet curtains, the heavy oak chairs, the rugs that had muffled so many screams, all of it went onto a pile. Mayev struck a match. The fire took hold slowly, then roared into life as it hit the old wood and dry fabric. A column of thick, black smoke rose into the Tulsa sky, a signal fire of their liberation. Mayev watched as the floral biscuit tin was consumed, the metal glowing red before the letters inside turned to white ash. "Where will you go?" Cassidy asked, standing beside her. The heat of the fire was a comfort against the morning chill. "Somewhere without a basement," Mayev said. She thought of her office, of the families that were still being broken. She wasn't done being a social worker. She was just done being a victim. She got into her car, the engine's hum a steady, real thing in the morning air. As she drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror. The house was a small, ugly silhouette against the rising sun. She turned onto the main road, the radio playing something low and soft. And for the first time in 34 years, Mayev Jenkins breathed in air that didn't taste of dust.